The moment General Marcus Voss stopped in the middle of that vineyard tent, ignored the bride-to-be standing 3 feet away in her new engagement ring, and looked straight past her at me, I felt every hair on my arms rise, the way it used to right before a convoy crossed a bad stretch of road.
The band had just started its second set. Somewhere behind me, a server was refilling ice at the bar, the small clatter of it the only ordinary sound left in a room that had, in the space of 3 seconds, stopped being ordinary at all.
"He did not say my name," he said, the other one. The one that had been retired from active use for almost 6 years. The one that had never once been spoken inside my family's house. The one only a small, specific circle of people on this earth had any right to know. "Iron Orchid," he said. "I owe you a debt I have never been able to pay in public. Let me start tonight." Behind him, 200 string lights swayed over rows of grapevines. My cousin Paige's champagne glass hovered somewhere between her mouth and the tray she'd been about to set it on. My mother's hand, which had been resting lightly on my forearm in that careful, correcting way she'd used my whole life, went still. For the first time in 21 years of service, my family was about to learn that the daughter they had spent 3 decades quietly filing under disappointing had a shadow they knew absolutely nothing about. I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of it, because it would be easy to make this sound like a fairy tale where a powerful man arrives and fixes everything with 1 sentence. That is not what happened. What happened that night cracked something open that had been sealed for a very long time. And cracking things open is rarely clean. It hurts on the way out. It hurt me. It hurt my mother. It hurt my cousin more than she let anyone see for a long time. But I am getting ahead of myself, the way people do when they finally get permission to tell a story they were never allowed to finish. To understand why 1 sentence from a stranger in dress blues could do more damage to my family's version of events than 21 years of my own silence, you have to go back to a house outside Millbrook, Ohio, where love sometimes came with a ledger nobody admitted they were keeping. My name is Vera Holloway. I retired as a full colonel 4 months before that party, after 21 years, 4 months, and 11 days of service. Though I only started counting the days near the very end, the way you count anything you're about to lose. I was an only child for the first 14 years of my life. My father, Frank Holloway, was a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, the kind of man who ironed his jeans on Sunday nights out of habit rather than necessity. He died when I was 13, in a training accident during a routine transport exercise overseas, the kind of death that doesn't come with a battlefield story. Just a folded flag and a chaplain who kept using the word instantaneous like it was supposed to be comforting. My mother, Diane, was 36 when she became a widow. She did not remarry. She also, in a way I wouldn't fully understand until I was much older, never entirely forgave the uniform that took him. Not the country, not the Corps as an institution, not in any way she'd ever say out loud at a 4th of July barbecue. Just the uniform itself, and everyone who chose to keep wearing one after my father couldn't anymore. I enlisted at 18. Some of it was grief dressed up as purpose. Some of it was simpler than that. I wanted to finish something my father had started, even if I couldn't have told you exactly what that something was. My mother did not come to my send-off. She said she had a shift she couldn't move. I believed her for about a decade. 14 years after I was born, my cousin Paige came into the world on my Aunt Carol's side of the family, and something in our household's emotional weather changed overnight. Paige was loud in the specific way that gets rewarded in families that have been quiet with grief for too long. She sang before she could properly talk. She twirled instead of walked. My mother, who had spent years moving through our house like she was trying not to disturb something fragile, would light up around Paige in a way I hadn't seen her light up since before the folded flag. I don't blame a toddler for being adored. I want to say that clearly, because it would be easy to tell this story like Paige was born villainous, and she wasn't. She was a little girl who got handed the job of being the family's proof that joy was still possible, and she took that job seriously for the rest of her life, sometimes at my expense, usually without meaning to. I remember the fall I made honor roll for the 4th consecutive semester, back when I still thought certificates meant something. I brought it home in a manila folder I'd kept flat the whole bus ride so it wouldn't crease. My mother taped it to the refrigerator, told me she was proud, and meant it in the moment, the way she meant most things in the moment.
2 days later, it came down to make room for a finger painting of a horse Paige had made in preschool. Purple mane, 6 legs, the kind of drawing that gets celebrated precisely because a 4-year-old made it. I didn't say anything. I told myself certificates were for kids who needed the validation, and I didn't need it. I remember standing in that kitchen, a long time anyway, looking at the blank spot on the refrigerator door, learning something about where I ranked that I would spend the next 3 decades confirming instead of questioning. I don't tell you this for sympathy about a refrigerator door. I tell you because that's where the pattern started, and patterns like that don't stay in kitchens. They walk into vineyards 9 years later, wearing a chairman's pin. My father used to be the one who noticed things like that. He'd find my report cards in my backpack without asking and leave a note on my pillow. Nothing elaborate, just saw this, proud of you, Dad. After he died, nobody replaced that job. I don't think my mother even realized it was a job that needed doing. Grief has a way of making people forget which small kindnesses were load-bearing until they're gone. That gap never got filled. Not by my mother, not by me, not for 20 years. Which is most of what you need to know before I tell you what I actually did for a living and why nobody in that tent knew it either. By the time I was in my 20s and moving through training pipelines I couldn't discuss over holiday dinners, our family had settled into an unspoken arrangement. Paige was the bright one, the one going places, the one whose accomplishments got framed and hung in the hallway. I was the quiet one, the one who worked in what my mother vaguely called logistics, the one whose visits home were treated like a courtesy rather than an occasion. I want to be precise about what my career actually became, because the word logistics did a lot of quiet damage over the years, and I let it. I moved from military intelligence into what the Army calls protective intelligence, assessing threats to people, not just places, and eventually running security details for personnel whose safety mattered enough that very few people were ever told their names. In my final years of service, I moved again into industrial security assessment, auditing defense contractors and subcontractors for the kind of vulnerabilities that don't show up on a balance sheet. It is unglamorous, exacting work. It is also work that decides, in very concrete terms, who gets access to programs that keep other people alive. None of that made it into conversations at my mother's kitchen table, not because I was being coy, because most of it was classified, restricted, or simply not the kind of thing you explain over pot roast without sounding like you were fishing for a reaction you weren't allowed to have. So my mother filled in the blanks with what was easiest to believe. My cousin filled in the blanks with what was funniest to repeat. And I let both of them, because correcting the record felt for a very long time like more work than it was worth. Once, at a cousin's wedding shower, someone asked me directly what rank I held, and my mother answered for me before I could open my mouth. Oh, something in the middle, I never can keep it straight, with a small laugh that told the room the question wasn't worth pursuing further. I was a captain at the time, closing in on major. I said nothing. I have thought about that laugh more times over the years than I would like to admit. Vera's between things right now, my mother told a neighbor once at a barbecue, while I stood 4 feet away holding a plate of coleslaw and a security clearance most of that backyard couldn't have pronounced the classification level of. I didn't correct her. I have never been good at correcting people who've already decided who I am. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. I made peace with that tired a long time before the night I'm about to tell you about, or I thought I had. Peace, it turns out, has a shelf life, same as anything else you store somewhere dark and hopeful keep. Paige got engaged to a man named Grant Ashford 3 months after I came home for good. Grant worked for his father's company, Ashford Industrial Group, a mid-sized manufacturer out of Columbus that had, in the last 2 years, gone from comfortable to the kind of comfortable that buys a lake house. Paige loved Grant. I want to say that clearly too, because whatever else happened at that engagement party, her feelings for him were never the problem. The engagement party was held at Hollow Creek Vineyard, a rented estate an hour outside the city, with rows of grapevines strung with warm white lights and long farm tables set with orchid centerpieces, because orchids were Paige's favorite flower and had been since she was 7 years old and decided she liked the word. I want you to hold on to that detail. It matters later, in a way none of us understood that night.
Retirement, I should tell you, had not been the soft landing people imagine. I'd been divorced 3 years by then, from a good man named David, who deserved a wife who came home on a predictable schedule, and got, instead, 6 years of a marriage conducted mostly over encrypted calls and missed birthdays. We didn't end badly. We ended tired, which is its own particular kind of grief. The grief of watching something die slowly instead of all at once. There were no children. There was a house in Georgia we sold within 4 months of the divorce, and a dog we shared custody of for a while, until I deployed again and it stopped making sense.
I had been home 4 months by the time of Paige's engagement party, still adjusting to a version of my life that didn't run on mission schedules, still catching myself listening for radio traffic that wasn't coming, still occasionally standing in grocery store aisles, overwhelmed by the sheer number of decisions civilian life expected me to make without a briefing first.
I almost didn't go to that party. I called Ray Delgado the night before, a former teammate of mine, one of maybe 6 people alive who knew what the word Orchid meant when it wasn't followed by the word arrangement, and told him I was thinking about sending a gift and a card instead. "You're going," Ray said, in the flat, unimpressed voice he used for talking me out of bad decisions for the better part of 2 decades. "You skip enough of your own life waiting for the right moment to show up, Vera. Go stand in the room. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to." I went, partly for Paige, whatever distance had grown between us over the years. Partly, I think now, because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to see if anything had changed. I didn't want to be the reason there was an empty chair at her engagement party, and I didn't want to keep being the reason I built the rest of my life around other people's comfort with my absence. I wore the one good dress I owned. I brought a gift I'd actually thought about. I drove myself, because I've never liked depending on someone else's timeline to leave a room. My mother greeted me at the entrance to the tent with a hug that lasted exactly as long as good manners required, and no longer. "You look tired," she said, which was her way of saying hello. "I'm fine, Mom." "You always say that." She smoothed a piece of hair off my forehead like I was still 9. "Go say hello to your aunt. And please, for tonight, let's not talk about work. It's Paige's night." I want to tell you that stung less than it did. It didn't. But I nodded, because that's the arrangement we'd had for 20 years, and arrangements are easier to keep than to renegotiate in a receiving line. My Aunt Carol was radiant in a way I'd rarely seen her, holding court near the gift table, introducing Grant's parents to anyone who came within 10 feet. Walter Ashford, Grant's father, was a broad, quiet man with an engineer's handshake and tired eyes that seemed to actually track the person he was talking to, which I noticed and filed away without knowing yet why it mattered. Carol caught my hand between both of hers, the way she did with everyone, warm and a little performative. "Vera, sweetheart, you made it. Isn't this venue something?" Walter and his wife found it. Apparently they know the owner from some charity board. She said it the way she said most things about the Ashfords that night, with a faint proprietary pride, as if their taste and their money had become, by virtue of the engagement, a little bit hers too. "And half of tonight is paid for by Ashford Industrial's biggest contract in a decade," Carol added, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets. "Some enormous defense deal. Walter doesn't like to talk numbers, but Grant let it slip." "And this is Paige's cousin Vera," Carol said when I approached, in the exact tone people use to introduce a coworker they don't really know. "She's recently transitioned out of the service." Transitioned out? As if I had quietly stepped sideways out of a job, rather than closed 21 years that had cost me a marriage, most of a decade of holidays, and part of the feeling in my left calf. "What did you do, exactly?" Walter Ashford asked, and there was nothing performative in the question. He seemed to actually want an answer. "A lot of assessment work, toward the end," I said. "Before that, protective operations." Protective operations. He nodded slowly, the way people do when a phrase almost unlocks something and then doesn't. "My work is duller than that. Manufacturing. Compliance paperwork mostly, believe it or not, even at our size." "Compliance paperwork keeps people alive more often than anyone gives it credit for," I said, and meant it more than he could have known. He smiled at that, actually smiled, the first real one I'd get from anyone in that tent for the next hour. My phone buzzed once against my hip, a restricted number I didn't recognize. I stepped just outside the edge of the tent to take it, kept my voice low and clipped, the way old habits never fully retire. It was short, a records clerk from my former command, confirming a final transfer of case files, now that my out-processing had closed. Nothing that should have mattered to anyone at that party. I came back in less than 2 minutes later. My mother asked, lightly, if everything was all right. Just work, I said, which was true, and also the kind of true that told her nothing at all. Then Paige found us, glowing, her ring catching the string lights every time she moved her hand, which she moved a great deal.
There she is, Paige said, looping her arm through Grant's and pulling me into a hug with her free arm, champagne glass somehow never spilling. My mysterious cousin. Vera, tell Walter about the time you got lost driving a supply truck and ended up at the wrong base for 2 days. That story kills every time.
It hadn't happened the way she told it. It had been a deliberate reroute around a compromised checkpoint, not a wrong turn. And I had never told her the details because I hadn't been allowed to. But I'd let the wrong version live for years because the real one wasn't mine to give away at a barbecue.
Maybe another time, I said.
She's so private about it, Paige told Walter, laughing lightly, the kind of laugh built for an audience. Honestly, I think it's because it wasn't that exciting. No offense, V. Not everyone's cut out for the glamorous stuff. Walter's eyes flicked to me for half a second, curious, but the conversation had already moved on, the way conversations about me always did in that family, drifting back toward Paige within 30 seconds, like water finding its lowest point. Near the bar, Doreen, one of my mother's oldest friends, patted my arm on her way toward the platform, where a bridesmaid was already helping Paige up to speak. Still no husband, sweetheart? Well, there's still time. Look at Paige. She found hers. I gave her the smile I'd been practicing since I was a teenager, the one that ends a conversation without starting one, and let her drift toward my cousin. I want to be fair here. Paige wasn't trying to be cruel. She was performing the version of me she'd been handed her whole life, the same way I'd let her. It only became cruelty in the accumulation, the way a single grain of sand means nothing, and a beach means everything. The first real crack came about 40 minutes later, during Paige's toast. She stood on a small platform near the head table, glass raised, guests gathering close, string lights haloing her hair in a way that would have made a beautiful photograph. A year ago, I honestly didn't think I'd find someone who got it, she said, voice carrying easily, practiced. Someone who understood what it means to actually build something. Grant's family didn't just hand him success. They earned every bit of the Kestrel contract. Do you know how many companies wanted that deal? Walter fought for 2 years to get Ashford Industrial cleared for it. 2 years. That's what real ambition looks like. Scattered applause. Grant looked proud and a little embarrassed the way people do when they're praised in public by someone they love. I used to think I wanted the quiet life, Paige went on, and here her eyes found mine across the tent, not accidentally. No offense to anyone who's living it, but I think some of us are just built for more visible things. Not everyone gets to be the exciting one, right, Vera? Light, easy, the kind that happens when a room is already decided who the joke is about and is simply grateful someone said it out loud. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, mostly so my hands would have something to do. I did not laugh. I have never been able to laugh at that particular joke, though I have gotten very good at not showing that. My mother, standing near me, said nothing in my defense. She never did. That was its own kind of answer, delivered in the same silence she'd been delivering it in since I was 18 years old, and she didn't come to my send-off. The toast ended. Music started back up. Guests drifted toward the bar, the way they do when the formal part of an evening gives way to the part where people start being honest, usually for worse. That's when my mother found me near the edge of the tent, away from the lights, where I'd stepped to get a breath of air that didn't smell like champagne and cut orchids. "You could try harder, you know," she said, without preamble, the way she said the things that hurt most. "Try harder at what, Mom?" At all of it, being present, letting people in. She wasn't cruel about it. That was somehow worse, the gentleness of it, the certainty. I know you don't like when I say this, but your father would want you to have built something by now.
A family. Something people can see.
I built plenty, Mom. You just never let me tell you what it was.
Don't do that, she said quietly. Don't turn this into some secret mission you can't talk about. I'm your mother. I know exactly what you did. You joined up, you moved every 2 years, and you never gave anyone a chance to actually know you. Just like... She stopped herself.
I watched her catch the sentence in her own teeth, too late to swallow it whole. Just like Dad, I finished for her, because someone had to say it, and it had been sitting in that family for 31 years waiting for someone to say it.
Her face went pale in the string lights. She didn't answer. She didn't need to.
For a second, I thought that might be the end of it, that we'd both quietly agree to leave the sentence unfinished, the way we always did, and let the band paper over the rest of the evening. My mother even managed a small, apologetic laugh, already reaching for my arm the way she did when she wanted a moment to be over.
That was the moment it wasn't. My mother's silence was still hanging in the space where my father's name should have been. I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way it used to right before something important happened in the field. That's when a man in a dark suit, with a chairman's pin on his lapel, walked into the tent like he owned the property it was rented from, and stopped dead when he saw me standing at the edge of the light. I recognized him before he recognized me. Marcus Voss, 4 stars, retired 5 years, now chairman and CEO of Kestrel Dynamics, one of the largest defense contractors in the country. I had seen his face in briefing photos and industry filings a dozen times in the last 2 years of my career. I had never expected to see it in person again, and certainly not at my cousin's engagement party. He scanned the tent once, the practiced sweep of a man who'd spent decades reading rooms for threat before he ever read them for small talk, and I watched the exact second his eyes landed on me and stopped moving. He crossed the tent in long, unhurried strides, past Walter Ashford, past Carol, past Paige, who actually reached out a hand toward him, assuming, reasonably, given whose party this was and whose contract had made the evening possible, that he'd come to congratulate her. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone murmur that he must be here to talk numbers with Walter before the ink dried on some new deal. A reasonable guess, and completely wrong.
He walked past all of it. He stopped in front of me.
Iron Orchid, he said, and every syllable of it landed in that tent like a dropped glass. I felt the whole party go still around us, the way sound falls away right before something important happens.
Sir, I said, I didn't know you'd been invited tonight.
Walter didn't tell me whose family this was, Voss said. If I'd known, I would have found you the moment I walked in, instead of making small talk with a caterer for 10 minutes. He looked at me for a long moment, something raw moving behind his composure. You look well, Colonel.
Colonel? My mother repeated, very quietly, from somewhere behind me. Paige's champagne glass finally made it to the table, set down with a small, unsteady clink. I'm sorry, General, is it? I think there's been some mistake. This is my cousin Vera. She was in logistics.
Voss turned toward her, and something in his expression hardened, not unkindly, but firmly. The way a man's face does when he realizes a joke he's just heard is not actually a joke at all. With respect, he said, I know exactly who I'm looking at. This woman is the reason I am standing in this tent tonight, instead of buried outside a mountain pass I am not permitted to name to you.
Nobody moved. I don't think anybody in that tent breathed for a full 3 seconds.
9 years ago, Voss said, and his voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that space. I was on an assessment trip overseas, evaluating a security posture at a diplomatic outpost that was about to be shut down. My convoy was ambushed on the return route, 2 vehicles disabled. I was pinned in the second one with a jammed door and a fire starting under the hood.
He looked at me the entire time he said it, not at the crowd.
Then Major Holloway was running protective intelligence for that outpost. She was not assigned to my detail. She was not required to be anywhere near that convoy. She rerouted her own security element against standing orders, got to my vehicle before the fire crew could, and pulled me out through a window frame with her bare hands, while taking shrapnel in her leg that she never let anyone treat properly until we were back inside the wire. I have walked past 100 memorial walls with names on them since that day. I don't walk past hers, because she's still here, standing in a tent full of people who apparently think she spent the last 2 decades filing paperwork. I hadn't let myself think about that road in a long time. Standing in that tent, hearing it out loud in someone else's voice, I was back there anyway for a half a second. The specific orange of the fire under the hood, the way the second vehicle's door had buckled just enough to trap a 2-star general who kept apologizing to me between coughs for being, in his words, dead weight. I remembered the sound my own leg made against the doorframe, a sound I didn't register as pain until an hour later. I remembered thinking, with the strange clarity you get in those moments, that I hadn't told my mother I loved her the last time we spoke on the phone, and being furious at myself for wasting a thought on that instead of the door. I remembered, too, the particular silence that comes after, the kind nobody warns you about. Not the silence of danger passing, but the silence of your own hands shaking once it's safe enough to notice them.
I came back to the tent in time to hear the last part of what Voss was saying.
I watched something happen to my mother's face that I had genuinely never seen before. Not the careful, managed grief she wore at every mention of my father. Something closer to a foundation shifting.
"You never told us," she said, and her voice cracked in the middle of it.
"I told you what I could when I could," I said, and I did not raise my voice, because I've never been someone who raises her voice. It was trained out of me a long time ago, replaced with something quieter, and I think more effective. You redirected every one of those conversations back to Paige within 30 seconds, every single time. I stopped trying because trying stopped meaning anything. My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I watched her search, the way people do when they're finally trying to remember all the times they chose not to listen, and finding more of them than they can carry at once. Paige was staring at me like she'd never actually seen my face before. "You never said anything," she managed. "All those years. The truck story. I made up half of what I told people because you never gave me anything real to work with."
I know, I said, and I meant it without cruelty. That's on both of us. I let the wrong story live because it was easier than defending the real one to people who'd already decided not to listen.
Voss cleared his throat, and something in his posture shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more deliberate. The way a man moves when he's about to say something he's decided is necessary rather than comfortable. "There's something else," he said, looking now not at me, but at Walter Ashford, who had come to stand near the edge of the small crowd that had gathered, his expression already uncertain, in a way that told me he suspected what was coming before it arrived. "Walter," Voss said, "you told me 2 years ago that the Kestrel subcontract almost died in review, a legacy compliance flag from a company you'd absorbed years earlier. You said it took a security assessment officer nearly a year to work through the file and finally certify you clean." 14 months, Walter said slowly. I never forgot it. I actually kept the certification letter. I'd never had a review that thorough, that fair. Most auditors want you to fail so they can justify the hours they've billed. This one didn't. She dug until she found the truth instead of the easy conclusion, and when the truth cleared us, she signed off without making us grovel for it. He was quiet for a moment. I never knew the name behind the signature block, just initials and a service number. Vera Holloway. The tent had gone so silent, I could hear ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away.
2 years, Paige had said in her toast, like it was Walter's own grit that had pulled it off. She just hadn't known which 2 years, or whose.
"That was me," I said. It came out steadier than I felt. "I didn't know your family was connected to mine when I certified that file, Walter. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a favor. I'd never met you. I didn't know Paige existed to you at all until tonight."
"I know," Walter said quietly. "That's exactly why it matters."
Somewhere in the back of my mind, the call I'd taken by the bar an hour earlier, a clerk closing out an old case file, nothing dramatic, nothing I'd thought twice about, settled into place beside everything else that was closing out that night. One loose thread of a career finally finding the rest of the pattern it belonged to.
I watched my cousin's face do something complicated. Not embarrassment exactly, something closer to vertigo. The specific dizziness of realizing the ground you built your whole adult life on was laid down by someone you've spent years quietly deciding wasn't worth listening to.
So the contract, Paige said slowly, like she was doing arithmetic she didn't want the answer to. The thing that changed everything for us. The thing I stood up there and bragged about like it was proof Grant's family earned their way in through sheer brilliance. That happened because of you.
It happened because your future father-in-law ran a compliant company and deserved a fair review, I said. I just happened to be the one who read the file carefully enough to see that. You could have told me, Paige said, and there was something almost like anger in it now, though I understood, even in the moment, that the anger wasn't really about me. You could have let me know, at some point in the last 2 years, that the biggest thing in my life was something you touched.
Paige, I couldn't discuss an active procurement review with my family even if I'd wanted to. That's not me being cold. That's the job. I paused. And even if I could have, would you have believed me? Or would it have sounded like I was trying to take credit for your happiness?
She didn't answer that. I don't think she had one ready. I wasn't sure she needed to give me one that night. My mother was still standing very close to me, close enough that I could feel her shaking slightly, though whether from cold or something else, I couldn't say. "Why didn't you ever push back?" she asked, so quietly it was almost just for me. "When I said those things about you, all these years?"
Because it never worked, I said. I tried at 26, after my first deployment. You changed the subject to Paige's school uniform. I tried again at Dad's grave, on the anniversary. You didn't want to talk about anything sad that day. I stopped there. I didn't say the rest of it out loud. That somewhere around 35, I'd simply run out of the energy it takes to keep explaining yourself to someone who's already decided the ending. Some things you only say to yourself. She flinched like I'd struck her, and I felt the old guilt rise up automatically, the way it always did, the reflex to soften what I'd just said. I let it rise. I did not act on it. That, I think, was its own kind of decision. Quieter than anything Voss had said, and it mattered more to what happened next than anything else that night.
It occurred to me, watching her absorb it, that I had spent 21 years learning to hold still under far worse than a mother's hurt feelings, and that some of that same stillness, the kind that had once kept me alive, was in this smaller room finally being put to a use I actually needed it for.
Voss, sensing correctly that the moment had moved past him into territory that wasn't his to referee, stepped back slightly, though not far.
"I didn't come here to blow up a family's evening," he said, to the group generally, though his eyes stayed on me. "I came because Walter mentioned a colonel he'd once worked with, and something about the timeline made me wonder. I had to know if it was you. I'm glad I was right, and I'm sorry it happened like this." He extended a hand, and I shook it, and something in the gesture felt more real than every polite hug I'd received from my own family that night combined. "If you're ever interested in consulting work, Colonel, Kestrel would be fortunate to have you. No pressure. I mean that."
"Thank you, sir," I said. "I'll think about it." He gave a small nod, the kind soldiers give each other, that doesn't need translating, and moved off to let Walter make quiet, sincere apologies to a stunned Paige and an even more stunned Grant, who kept looking at me like he was trying to reconcile the woman who'd been introduced to him as quiet, kind of a homebody, with the one a 4-star general had just called the reason he was alive. Grant found me by the coat rack before I managed to leave, looking younger than he had all evening. "I should have said something during the toast," he said. "I felt it land wrong and didn't say anything. That's not an excuse."
You're allowed to not fight every battle at your own engagement party, Grant.
Maybe, but my father built half of what we have on a fair review some officer gave him when she didn't have to be, and that officer was sitting at our table getting laughed at all night. "Good," I said, not unkindly. "Thinking about it is more than most people manage tonight."
He nodded, looked like he might say more, then didn't. I let the silence stand instead of filling it for him. I didn't stay for the rest of the toasts. I want to be honest about that, because it would make for a tidier story if I'd stayed, gracious and glowing, and let the evening end on a wave of applause for the family's overlooked hero.
That's not who I am, and it's not what that moment needed.
I found my coat.
My mother caught my arm at the edge of the tent, the same careful hand that had corrected my posture at the entrance 2 hours earlier, now trembling slightly against my sleeve.
Are you leaving? I think I have to, I said. Not because I'm angry, because I need to sit with this somewhere quiet before I say something I don't mean.
I don't understand how I didn't know, she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she sounded lost rather than certain. How did I raise you and not know this?
You knew enough, I said gently. You just decided a long time ago that it wasn't the kind of knowing you wanted to do the work for. That's not the same as not knowing, Mom. I think you should sit with that difference before you call me tomorrow.
I walked out into the cool dark beyond the string lights, past rows of grapevines silvered by a half moon, and I did not look back to see who was watching me go.
3 days passed before my mother called. I want to tell you I expected it sooner, given how the party ended, but I've learned not to predict my mother's timelines around anything difficult. She called on a Tuesday evening, and I almost let it go to voicemail, the way I had with most of her calls in recent years, out of a habit built from disappointment rather than malice.
I picked up. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, no greeting, which was unlike her, about knowing enough and not doing the work.
Okay.
I want to come see you, not to talk about the party, to talk about your father. That surprised me more than anything Voss had said in that tent.
She came the following Saturday, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and told me things I had never heard in 31 years. That she had begged my father not to re-enlist for that final tour. That she had been so angry at him for saying yes anyway, that some part of her had never fully forgiven him even after he died. Because you cannot properly grieve someone you are still furious at, and grief without permission to be angry curdles into something else entirely.
When you enlisted, she said, staring into her cold coffee, some ugly part of me thought you were choosing him over me, choosing the thing that took him. I know that's not fair. I know it's not what you were doing. But every time you called with news about a promotion or a new assignment, I heard your father's voice telling me it would all be fine, right before it wasn't. So I stopped listening for the details. I told myself I was protecting myself. I think I was really just punishing you for staying in a life that scared me. She told me about the day the casualty officer came to the house, how she'd seen the car through the front window and known, the way you know weather is coming before the first drop falls. She'd sat on the porch steps for 11 minutes deciding whether to let him knock, because as long as he hadn't knocked yet, some part of her life was still intact. I never told anyone that, she said, not even your father's mother. Some part of me has been sitting on those steps for 31 years, refusing to let anyone knock. I thought about how much of my own silence over the years had been its own version of those 11 minutes, a way of keeping something bad from becoming official by simply not saying it out loud. I used to think you didn't want to know me, I finally said. Now I think you were scared of what knowing me would cost you if I disappeared the way he did. She nodded, and for the first time all afternoon, she looked less like she was defending herself and more like she was simply telling the truth because it was finally safe enough to. You could have told me that, I said. Any of it. Any time in 21 years. I know. She finally looked up at me. I convinced myself you didn't need it. The attention, the questions, the fuss. You never asked for it, so I told myself you didn't want it. I stopped asking, Mom. That's different from not wanting it. She nodded slowly, and something in her face, for the first time in longer than I could remember, looked like it was actually absorbing what I'd said, instead of managing it. I didn't hand her a clean forgiveness that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a tidier ending if I had. What I gave her instead was the beginning of a different arrangement, one where I told her plainly that I needed her to ask real questions and sit through real answers, even the boring ones, even the ones that didn't resolve into a good story. She agreed. It has not been perfect since. It has been better. Paige showed up at my apartment 8 days after the party. No makeup, hair pulled back, holding a folder I didn't understand the significance of until she set it on my counter. I did some digging, she said, about the ambush, about the certification,
I wanted to understand what actually happened, instead of the version I would have made up to tell people at a party. Inside the folder were printouts, a redacted commendation summary Voss's office had apparently been willing to share with her when she'd asked directly, and a copy of the certification letter Walter had kept for 2 years, my initials at the bottom of it, in the small, unremarkable handwriting of someone who had never once expected anyone in her own family to go looking for it. "I've been trying to figure out why this hurts as much as it does," Paige said, sitting down across from me at my small kitchen table, the same one my mother had sat at a week earlier. "And I think it's because I built my whole personality around being the interesting one, the one who did things. And it turns out, the most quietly extraordinary thing in our entire family's life happened because of the cousin I used to make fun of at barbecues."
You didn't know, I said. I never gave you the chance to know.
That's generous of you to say. It's not entirely true, though, is it? I made it easy not to know. Every time you tried to say something real, I turned it into a punchline, because punchlines got laughs, and honesty made people uncomfortable. I did that on purpose, more times than I want to admit.
I didn't argue with her. I think if I'd rushed to reassure her the way I used to rush to smooth over every hard moment in that family, it would have let her off the hook too easily, and neither of us needed that.
Do you remember the bike? Paige said. That parking lot behind the church, the summer Mom's divorce fell apart? You had 4 days of leave and spent all of it teaching a 7-year-old to ride a bike.
"I remember," I said. "You crashed into a dumpster twice and refused to cry about it either time. I liked that about you even then."
I don't know when I stopped being that kid and started being the one who needed a room to look at her a certain way, Paige said, her voice thinner than I'd heard it in years. I think somewhere along the way I decided being impressive was safer than being known. It's easier to perform confidence than to actually have it.
"What do you want from me now?" I asked instead. She turned her water glass a quarter turn on the table, not drinking from it, just needing something to do with her hands, the way I usually did. "I keep thinking about the folder," she said. "How I went looking for facts instead of just calling you and asking. That's probably its own kind of tell, isn't it? Even trying to make it white, I did it the way I do everything. Research it, build a case, show up prepared instead of just showing up."
That's not nothing, Paige. Most people don't do even that much.
Maybe. It still feels like I'm performing being sorry instead of actually being it. I didn't correct her. I think she needed to sit with that discomfort a little longer than I was willing to smooth over for her. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know exactly. I think I want to actually know you, not the version I made up. I want you to be part of the wedding in a way that's real, not just a seat at a table. And I want to stop being someone who needs to be the exciting one so badly that I make other people small to get there." "That's a lot to want from one conversation," I said. "I know. I'm not asking you to fix it today. I'm asking if you'll let me try." I thought about the years she'd spent as the family's proof that joy was still possible after my father died, a job she never applied for and never got to quit. I thought about how much of her performance at that engagement party had probably been less about cruelty and more about a fear, buried under all that champagne-bright confidence, that if she ever stopped being the special one, nobody would notice her at all. "I'll let you try," I said, "but Paige, I need you to actually listen this time, not perform listening. Listen." "I can do that," she said, and for the first time in a long time, I believed her.
A year passed the way years do, when you finally stopped holding your breath through them. I took Voss up on the consulting offer, part-time, work that let me use 2 decades of judgment without asking me to disappear into it the way active duty had. My mother and I started having dinner every other Sunday, and more than once she asked me a real question about my work and actually let the silence sit until I answered, instead of filling it with something about Paige. Paige and Grant's wedding took place at the same vineyard, under the same rows of lights, though this time the Orchid centerpieces felt less like an ironic coincidence and more like something I'd made peace with. The evening air smelled the same, cut grass and warm citronella, and somewhere underneath it the faint green smell of the vines themselves. And for a moment, when I first walked in, I half expected to feel my spine straighten the way it had a year earlier, bracing for a joke that never got made this time.
Walter Ashford sought me out early in the evening, before the ceremony, and shook my hand with the same steady grip he'd had the first time we met. I framed that certification letter, he told me, not to display it, just so I'd never forget what a fair review actually looks like when someone bothers to do the job properly. Voss came too, off the clock. No chairman's pin this time, just a guest in a gray suit who spent most of the night talking to Grant's uncles about fishing and let exactly one comment slip that I was, in his words, the best officer I ever had the privilege of nearly dying in front of, which got the biggest laugh of the reception and for once didn't come at my expense.
Paige asked me to stand up during the reception, not as a joke, not as a punchline setup. She kept it short.
A year ago at this exact venue, she said, looking out at the crowd before finding me near the back, where I still tend to stand, old habits taking their time to loosen. I thought being the special one meant making sure everybody noticed me first. My cousin taught me, in the hardest possible way, that the people who are actually extraordinary, she never once used that as leverage over any of us, even when we gave her every reason to. That's not logistics. That's not a desk job. That's the realest kind of strength I've ever seen up close, and I spent years too busy performing my own importance to notice it standing right next to me. She didn't say the call sign. She didn't need to. There was no gasp this time, no ripple of shock through the crowd, no general stepping forward to unravel a secret nobody was ready for. This wasn't that kind of moment, and I think Paige finally understood that some truths don't need an audience to be real. My mother found me by the edge of the dance floor afterward, the same spot I'd stood in a year earlier when everything cracked open. She was wearing blue, not the careful neutral she usually chose for family events, and she danced twice already, once with Walter Ashford's brother-in-law, and once, badly and laughing about it, with Grant.
I should have asked more, she said, instead of assuming I already knew the answer.
I know, Mom. I'm not asking you to erase the 21 years it took me to get here. I'm not interested in erasing them, I said. I'm interested in what we build from here, with our eyes open. She nodded and reached for my hand, and for once I let her hold it without pulling away out of old habit. I used to believe the night at Paige's engagement party was the moment my family finally discovered who I was. I don't think that anymore. They didn't need to learn who Iron Orchid was. They needed to learn how to actually see Vera. Not the quiet daughter filed away as a disappointment, not the invisible signature at the bottom of a compliance letter. Just the woman who had been standing in the room with them the entire time, waiting far longer than she should have had to, for someone to finally look. I still keep the little enamel orchid pin from the program that gave me my call sign in a nightstand drawer, next to my father's dog tags. I don't wear either one. I don't need to. Some nights I take them out anyway, not out of grief, more like a kind of accounting. Proof the quiet years added up to something, even during all the years nobody was counting alongside me. If Voss had never walked into that tent, if Walter had gone to a different party, if the timing had been an hour off, the truth about the certification letter would still have been sitting in a filing system somewhere, accurate and unclaimed. I would have gone on letting my family believe whatever version of me was easiest to carry. I say that not to diminish what happened, but because the recognition, when it finally came, wasn't the thing that made any of it real. It was only the thing that made it visible. Those aren't the same. Mistaking one for the other is, I think, the quiet tragedy at the center of every family that only learns to see someone once a stranger insists on it.
If any part of this story found you somewhere real tonight, if you've ever been the quiet one in a room that only had eyes for someone louder, or the parent who mistook silence for peace, or the golden child who's just now realizing how much someone else quietly carried so you wouldn't have to, tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, stay close. This is far from the last family that's going to learn they misjudged exactly the wrong person.